select events or conversations that took place leading up to the Garden of Gethsemane scene. And for the most part, I've been trying to tackle these things in chronological order as best as I can. Last week, of course, we covered the event known as the triumphal entry, in which Jesus rode into the temple grounds riding on a donkey, the animal of peace, to declare his kingdom, while his followers and many in the crowd laid down their coats and waved palm branches and collectively cried aloud, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna, Hosanna." The scene caused quite a ruckus with the townspeople, and incoming travelers were inquiring of who he is. Who is this man? The Pharisees are trying to appeal to him to quiet the crowd because they didn't believe in his identity. And Jesus demonstrated sadness and disappointment in the fact that in the years to come, Jerusalem would suffer the consequences of rejecting him, saying that they did not recognize the time of their visitation. That's kind of going to lead into Matthew 24 today. For all the hoopla and drama, though, leading up to the arrival into the temple, it ended in a very anticlimactic way, in that Jesus kind of took a look around and then left and went back home, and went back to where he was staying in Bethany, just outside the city. The entire event, though, was really the prelude to the prelude, so to speak, the beginning of what would become a very eventful week. The next morning, that would kind of take off when he, as he's going back into Jerusalem, and he curses the fig tree for not producing fruit. You might remember that story. There was kind of a visual illustration of the end of Judaism, or the end of the Old Testament covenant. And then, of course, that followed by Jesus kind of cleaning house. Sweeping house, right? You remember that? He goes in and he just kind of ransacks the tables of the money changers, and he cast out those who were selling animals at exorbitant costs and taking advantage of all the incoming travelers and so forth. And basically, instead, they turned the house of God or the temple of God into a den of thieves. They leverage it to make money. They leverage it for something it wasn't meant for. And more importantly, they were using the court of the Gentiles to do so. The place was supposed to be the only place in the entire temple ground where the Gentiles could come in and pray. And then because of their prejudice, because of their hatred toward Gentiles, they used this area as a marketplace to keep the Gentiles out. That's really what he was trying to do. That's a whole different story altogether. But that was all on Monday, and there was a few other things that happened on Monday. Now we go into Tuesday. Tuesday was a very, very eventful day in Passion Week. A lot of confrontation. This is where he did the 7 woes of the Pharisees. A lot of confrontation with the Pharisees, some really important parables that took place, some healings, some observation. This is where Jesus and the disciples watched the widow who gives her last mite, her last penny. So that takes place on Tuesday. And as they're getting ready to leave town on Tuesday, one of the disciples, we don't know which one for sure, makes a comment about the walls and the buildings of the temple and the temple courtyard, and just how magnificent, how magnificent it really was. And that's the story that we're leading up to today in Matthew 24. In your red Bible, it's page 1538. Okay, and the disciple makes this observation for good reason. If you understood what had really happened and what the temple, how it was really built and all that stuff, is really fascinating. They were truly one of the great wonders of the world at the time. In fact, thanks to Herod the Great's ingenuity and vision, it was still a work in progress even then, even as the disciples were walking through it. It wasn't completely completed until 64 AD, and only then to be destroyed 6 years later. Now, this was the second temple. The first temple was, of course, Solomon's temple, where Solomon's temple was just magnificent, much bigger, much more glorious. That one was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC when Babylon invaded Jerusalem. And it was started to be rebuilt some 50 years later, and it was completed after a few delays and interruptions in 516 BC, 70 years after the first one was destroyed, just the way it was predicted in the Old Testament. However, a few who had lived long enough to see Solomon's temple and then see the new temple get rebuilt were really disappointed. You might remember this. They were disappointed because it was smaller. It just wasn't as magnificent as they remembered. And God told them, don't sweat the day of small things. One day, something much more glorious is going to happen in this temple that never happened in Solomon's temple. And of course, he was talking about Jesus visiting that temple. Now, when Herod the Great comes along, He was known as a master builder, a glorious building, the glorious structures all over the place. And this was going to be his coup d'etat, so to speak. He appealed to the Jewish rulers to see if they would let him expand the temple area and make massive modifications to the temple itself. And they give him the approval, and he stepped out on a project that would become his masterpiece. In fact, like I said, he died before it was ever completed. But he doubled the entire temple area to about 35 acres, and he builds a wall around it. He makes the side of the temple itself almost 15 stories tall in terms of height. Now keep in mind, this is built on a small mountain. All right, so everything they did, they had to carry up the mountain. They didn't possess the modern equipment we have today, the trucks and the cranes and all that kind of stuff. Some of the original foundation stones of the wall are still standing today. One of those foundation stones, known as the Western Stone, is 41 feet long, 11.5 feet high, and 15 feet or more thick, and weighed approximately 400 to 500 tons, by some accounts. The temple itself, like I said, was about 15 stories high. Even more than the size, however, were the adorning features. Listen to a description by the first century Jewish historian named Josephus as he described the beauty and the impact of it. Here's what he writes. The outward face of the temple in front was covered all over with plates of gold of great weight, and at the first rising of the sun reflected back a fiery splendor, forcing those who looked upon it to turn their eyes away, just as they would have done at the sun's own rays. But this temple appeared to strangers when they were coming to it from a distance like a mountain covered with snow. For as to those parts of it that were not covered with gold, they were exceedingly white. You get the picture here. This is an unbelievable structure, and all that built on a mountain without the convenience of technology and so forth. Definitely one of the greatest architectural wonders of the world. So you can understand why the disciples were greatly admiring this structure as they passed it on the way out of town. And like most people of their day, and even in still our day, size and beauty was something that meant something. When someone could visualize something that big, some kind of structure that enormous, there was a certain pride that came with it. It was part of the nation's identity. You might get overwhelmed if you ever go to Washington, D.C., right, to see the White House and the Washington Monument, or maybe to New York City before the towers came down. There's a reason why the people, bin Laden people attacked the Twin Towers. It was the tallest buildings we had in the world. And it wasn't to attack the building, it was to attack the identity of America, right? And the same thing with the temple. This was the identity of the Jewish people. This is where, in their belief, that God resided. This was their temple. This was their magnificent structure, their identity. Now today we can imagine very easily all the ways that someone could take down a huge structure. I mean, we have planes and bombs and missiles. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that can be done. But this wasn't the case in first century Israel, which makes Jesus' response to the disciples' admiration that much more incredible. And it also puts the foreknowledge of Jesus to the test, because he said that all these things that he's about to mention are going to happen within a certain time period. Now, in the conversation that follows, as a result of some inquisitive questions by a few apostles, two things take place, and it's really important to understand this. First, Jesus tells them what they can expect in the very near future, which is now our distant past, okay? The thing that we're going to talk about from the first 35 verses was for the disciples in the very near future, but it is now part of our distant past. It's very important to understand that. The second thing he does, he tells them what he expects of his followers in the future, which now includes our present as well. Okay, that makes sense? The things he tells them what he expects of them was for their future, but it's also for our present and our future. But the things he talked about in the first part of Matthew 24 only regard their future, our past. So it's important that we understand that as we go through this. Majority of this conversation is recorded in Matthew 24 and 25, and there's some variations of it recorded in Mark and Luke. We're not going to get into that today. Now, before we start reading through this, let me highlight a very important thing. It cannot be emphasized enough how important context is when it comes to reading Scripture. Without context, if you don't take context into consideration, you can make the Scripture mean anything you want it to mean, and you can apply it in ways that was never meant to be applied. People do it all the time. And nowhere does this critical truth seem to be cast aside or ignored as it does with this conversation between Jesus and his apostles regarding some of the events that was going to take place in their very near future. Context, among other things in this case, include understanding who it's being spoken to. So when Jesus uses the word you, Y-O-U, who is he speaking to? He's speaking to the disciples. He's not speaking to us 2,000 years later in this case. Okay, it includes being familiar with Old Testament biblical language, which we're going to get into in just a moment, that's being used to emphasize a point that the original audience would have understood, but a little bit more foreign to us, or we've taken it out of context. And context also means understanding the word the way they were meant to be understood in the original Greek language. We're going to get a little bit into that, not much. I'll point these out as we go along the way, okay? So here we are, Matthew 24. I'm going to try to read this quickly if I can, but I'm also going to stop along the way to point out a few things. Here we go. Jesus left the temple, and he was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, don't you? Truly I say to you, there will not be left one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." That's an amazing prediction right there. But notice how he says that. Thrown down. In other words, this won't be something that takes place as a result of an earthquake or anything. This will be intentional. It will be an intentional act of some kind that causes this destruction. Now, to the apostles' credit here, they don't laugh. They don't say, "Oh, that could never happen." They don't doubt Jesus' words when he says it's going to happen. They just simply want to know how. In their mind, though, only a catastrophic end-of-the-world scenario could possibly make this true. There's no other way. Bear in mind, they didn't have bombs and missiles and planes, anything like that. So they ask him a question about when this will happen, and assuming that it would be the end of the world, the only way they could see how it's happening, they want to know when and what to look for. All right, so that's the mindset of the disciples that they ask these questions. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, according to Mark, it is Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and they asked, "Tell us when these things will be. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" I want to that little word "end." I want to draw your attention to something. Here's where a little understanding of Greek word is really critical. When they ask this question, in the Greek, they use the word sunteleo. Sunteleo, or variations of it, means the end of all things, the end of the world, like when we talk about the end of the world. Okay, that's what it means. That's what they're imagining here. There's another word, Greek word, when it comes to talking about time or the end of something, is the word telos. Telos is a reference to the end of a specific era or a process or a chain of events. In other words, not the end of all things, it's the end of something. All right, there's the difference. But they use the word sunteleo, thinking that Jesus is obviously talking about the end of the world. In their question to Jesus, asking about the end of the age, that's the word they use. They're assuming it's going to be the end of the world that makes all of this happen. However, in his answer, Jesus changes the course of the conversation with a switch in the wording. You see, they asked two questions regarding two events that they felt were correlated with one another. But in his answer, he separates the destruction of the temple and the events surrounding it from the end of the world that will correlate with his ultimate return. So listen to what he says, verse 4. "And Jesus answered them, 'See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place. But the end is not yet.'" Here's where he switches the word. When he uses that word "end," he's not talking about sunteleo, the end of all things. Now he's talking about the end of something. He's using telos. All right, so that's very important. That's a switch that Jesus makes. And now he's about to separate the destruction of the temple and the end of the world. He's telling them that some of these things that will be happening when the end of the temple is drawing near. But the things he points to also could be happening, could pretty much describe any point in history. When are there not wars and rumors of war, right? I mean, basically what he's saying there is that, a lot of things are going to be happening just the way they already happen. Wars, rumors of wars, and so forth. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of birth pains. Now, people say this sometime today and think, "Oh man, look at these earthquakes in China, look at this and look at that," right? Look at the fires in California. But there were more than enough things going on in first century Israel. There were 17 recorded earthquakes in the first century alone in this part of the world. There were all kinds of wars going on, rumors of wars. There was internal strife within Rome itself. There was actually 4 different Caesars in the year 68, 69 AD. There was a lot of turmoil going on. So basically, Jesus said that it won't be too much different than any other period of time in some ways. However, he's about to make this a little bit more personal. All right? And here's where another very important that needs to be clarified in terms of context comes into play. Remember who Jesus is talking to in this conversation. All right? Again, like I said before, when he uses the word "you," he's talking to the disciples. Not talking to you and me 2,000 years later. He's talking to 4 specific guys, probably eventually 12, but 4 to begin with. Sometimes in our appeal to apply God's truth to our lives, we tend to make things specifically told or promised to a certain individual or certain group of people about us as if it was intended to have a broader context outside of broader meaning outside of the context it was intended. Does that make sense? So we have to be very careful when we read the scripture. Some conversations are meant for these guys, we get to listen in on it. It's not meant to apply to us. This is one of those situations. Verse 9, he says, they will deliver you, meaning the disciples, up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, again, telos, he's talking about the end of the specific thing, will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Again, he's talking about telos here. He's talking about the end of this thing. Now, here's something else I need to point out. The word whole world here. The word whole world comes from a Greek word that's very similar to the word oikos, which is where we get the word community from. This was a term that the Romans adopted from the Greeks. Like the Greeks before them, the Romans believed that the only world that really mattered was their world, their empire. Everyone and everything outside of it was insignificant. So when you see the whole world in some words, when used by this Greek word, he's not talking about America or anything else. He's talking about the Roman Empire. It's the same word that Luke used in Luke chapter 2, verse 1, saying that Caesar Augustus was taking a census of the whole world. Was he really taking a census of everybody in Africa? No. He was taking a census of the Roman Empire. That's the same wording here. There was a different word used for the entire universe. It was cosmological in that sense. In other words, it was cosmos was the word. So there's a difference in what he's used here. So when he's talking about the whole world, he's talking about the Roman Empire. Okay? So it's very important to understand that. The abomination of desolation, verse 15. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, in parentheses, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to get his coat or his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Woe unto them. The abomination of desolation is another term that has been made these days to fit into a modern day context. So what is this abomination of desolation? Well, in Greek terminology, an abomination is something that causes disgust or hatred, and desolation is a state of complete emptiness or destruction. This is the first of a few times when Jesus will borrow from Old Testament language, Old Testament imagery, to draw a parallel. This one particularly comes out of Daniel 9, 10, 11, and 12, in which he is prophesying complete destruction, and it usually referred to the presence of an idol or idol worship. But an abomination of desolation can be a person, it can be an idol, it can even be a series of things that point to the emptiness or destruction taking place. In the days leading up to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the people were trapped in the temple grounds where the Roman army was outside of the temple trying to beat down the wall, trying to break in, and so forth. In that process, many of the Israelites turned on each other to the point that there were so many casualties caused against one another that bodies were piled up on the steps leading up to the temple. If you read Josephus, it's amazing some of the things that were going on. In fact, more people were killed internally amongst each other than were killed by the Romans. This is how bad it was. They had actually, one particular faction there was civil wars going on, and one particular faction destroyed all the food, which caused famine. They were eating each other, cannibalism. Unbelievable things were going on. That is an abomination of desolation occurrence, okay? That's exactly what he's talking about. But to understand what Jesus is saying here, we kind of need to look at Luke's version. In Luke, he says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by the army, then you know that its desolation has come near. So what is this abomination? Basically, it's the Roman army surrounding the temple. In verse 20, it says, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath, for there will be great tribulation. First of all, why winter? Because of weather, right? Sabbath because you weren't allowed to travel on the Sabbath. You couldn't get out of the town on the Sabbath. So he's saying, pray that this thing that I'm talking about, this telos event, doesn't happen during the winter or on the Sabbath. For there will be great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, and no, never will be. And if these days had not been cut short, no human would have been saved. For the sake of the elect, these days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, don't go out. Look, he's in the inner room, don't believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. A lot of Old Testament imagery here. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heaven will be shaken. Then will appear in the heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and all of the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. It sounds a lot like second coming, doesn't it? But that's not what this is. When we read this section from verses 29 to 31, it's very tempting because of the language used to mistakenly think that he is referring to his second coming. But Jesus is using Old Testament imagery here and language to describe this act of judgment against Jerusalem for their failure to recognize who he was and for crucifying the Son of God. This is what Jesus talked about. He said that they did not recognize the time of their visitation. This is what he's talking about, the destruction of Jerusalem, the incredible things that were going to happen in 70 AD. Verse 29 appears to be pointing to cosmological events that would take place prior to the return of Jesus. But what it really is that Jesus is using Old Testament hyperbole much in the same way we do when we talk about major events. This is not unusual to us. How many have you ever heard something like the shot heard around the world, right? Remember that? That was what was kind of referred to in World War II, the shot heard around the world. Or turning the world upside down. Or, hey, I would move heaven and earth to go out with that person or to marry that person. We use that same kind of language. In the same way, Jesus is using cosmological hyperbole to describe the magnitude of what would be happening when this telos event, this destruction of Jerusalem would happen. But he also wanted to make it very clear that it wasn't just any kind of human army attacking Jerusalem. It was actually an act of God carried out through the instrument of a human army. In other words, he wanted to make sure that Jerusalem understood, or that the people understood, that this was God doing, not just Roman doing. Okay, that's why he's using some of this language. That's why he says that you will see the Son of Man coming on the cloud of heaven. If you do a little research in the Old Testament, you'll discover that this very language was used to describe God's act of judgment toward a nation or people, even in the Old Testament. It was a way of describing certain events as something that God was doing and not by man's own initiative. The event of the destruction of Jerusalem would be the catalyst that would ultimately send the followers of Jesus beyond the reigns of the Roman Empire to spread the gospel to the rest of the world. That's what verse 31 is referring to. How do we know that? Because Jesus is still talking about the effects and the impact of the destruction of Jerusalem. Let's read on. Verse 32, from the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branches become tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, and here's how we know that everything is talking about this one event. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my word will not pass away. Heaven and earth was a term that was used to describe the temple in the first century. All right. Now, when he said the generation will not pass away, he's not talking about 2,000 years from now. He's talking about a generation in Jewish terms, which was about a 40-year period. This verse 34 and verse 35 are the bookends of this particular event, this conversation that Jesus is talking about. All right? In other words, everything up to this point is referring to the end of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. And he advises the disciples that this will take place in their time, in their generation, which is typically a 40-year lifetime. And guess what? 40 years from this conversation is exactly when it took place. 70 AD came, and the Romans were it was almost like they were possessed, according to Josephus. They literally destroyed everything. Josephus wrote that it was like they were just possessed. Their own general could not stop the soldiers' fervor in destroying the building and killing the people that were left. They tore the building down one stone at a time, one by one, tore everything down, just the way Jesus said it would happen. Now Jesus, in verse 36, changes the conversation. Now he goes to the Suntaleo event. He says, but concerning that day and that hour, which day and hour? The day of his return. Concerning that day and that hour, no one knows, not even the angel of heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. For as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. You see, now he's moved beyond the destruction of the temple and in Jerusalem. He's speaking of his ultimate return. And what event does he say will take place then? How will we know? When will it happen? What specific does he point to? None. He didn't know. Even the Son did not know at that point, period. It would be like any other day he suspected. That's why verse 38 says, for as in the day before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage. They were living life. They were living on the high end, right? That's what they were doing. Until the day Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. And then he described what that event's going to look like. There will be 2 men in the field. One will be taken, one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken, one will be left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in part of the night the thief was coming, he would have had to stay awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore you must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master hath set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. And truly I say to you, he will set him over all of his possessions. So basically what Jesus is saying here, he's not talking in verse 40 through 43 about rapture. Rapture was an event that was made up in 1830. And 200 years of taking a life on its own. Okay, he's not talking about. In fact, it's interesting because I pointed to this. So what is Jesus saying? 50% make it, 50% don't? No, he's not giving percentages here. He's just telling what you can kind of expect. All right? And if you look at the days of Noah, who was it that was swept away? Who was it that was taken away? It wasn't the righteous, right? It was the godless people. They were taken away, and the righteous stayed. In fact, if you look at the parable of Jesus in Matthew 13, what we know is the parable of the wheat and the weed, what happens first? The weeds get bundled up and destroyed. That's what happens first, not the righteous taken away like the so-called rapture does. So, all right, so this is why I get so frustrated when people talk about this rapture thing, because it's not a biblical event. There's nowhere in the scripture that they talk about this. All right. Again, like in the days of Noah, the wicked will go first, and the righteous will be taken care of last. All right. Many people believe that we're going to be right here on the earth, that the earth will be completely renewed and restored the way it was the original creation. Okay, so that's the conversation that takes place. Now, we move past this real quick. From Matthew 24 is about everything that the near future of the disciples. And for us, it's our past. 2,000 years ago almost now. It's gone. It's over with. But now Jesus talks about what he expects of his people in Matthew 25. He tells 3 parables. Okay, one is the parable of the 10 virgins. I'm going to have you read that on your own. But oftentimes we forget that in our lifetime, which sometimes feels very short and very quick, and other times feels very long, like it's never going to end, it's really but a blink of an eye in God's time. Right? He doesn't operate by our clock. When we become followers, we are taught that Jesus could return at any moment. And we begin the spiritual journey with the expectation and the sense of urgency. But as the days turn into weeks, and as the weeks turn into months, and the months turn into years, sometimes we lose that sense of urgency. We lose that sense of expectation. We can very easily become lackadaisical, weary, disappointed, and even frustrated that Jesus hasn't returned yet. And that compounded even more when we see all the violence and the godlessness around us increase exponentially. We just like, come on, Jesus, come on, where you at? You know, it's our lifetime. We've been here. We've been waiting. But the same thing happened to the people in the disciples' lifetime. It's why Peter had to remind the audience in 2 Peter with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years. 1,000 years is one day. Jesus is not slow about fulfilling this promise of his return. He just doesn't want anyone to perish. Right? But the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night, he says. And then the heavens will pass away with the roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. See, the moral of the story of the 10 virgins is that don't let the patience of God in sending his son to collect the harvest lead us into a lackadaisical life. Don't lose the sense of urgency or sense of significance of being his presence in the world. Don't let doubt creep in or the ridicule of non-believers lead you to thinking that it will never happen, because it will happen. How many of you have seen the movie Hoosiers? Most of you seen that movie? Do you remember the scene in the movie Hoosiers? Dennis Hopper, the assistant coach, is drawing up a final play. And he tells them, you need to set this called the picket fence, right? And he tells them, now boys, don't get caught watching the paint dry. Remember that line? It's kind of a thing, don't get a 3-second call on you by standing in a place and doing nothing. I kind of think of that when I read this story. Jesus is telling us, don't get caught watching the paint dry. Don't get caught standing and doing nothing. Move, do something. And that's the whole idea of the parable of the 10 virgins. Then he tells another story, the parable of the talents. We're all familiar with that one. And the idea of that is be intentional. And my little catchphrase with that one is, what you do with what you get determines, what you do with what you got determines what you get. All right, we're not all given the same talents, we're not all given the same skills, we're not all given the same sense of responsibility. Some get 5 talents, some get 2, some get 1. But what we do with that determines how our judgment how will we judge at the end. And finally, he tells the parable of the sheep and the goats. The sheep will be the ones, those who are serving those around them, particularly those in the rest of the world, the rest of the world has forgot, or written off, or cast aside and ignored. That's why Jesus said, look at everybody like they're me. If you see someone hungry, give them food. If you see someone thirsty, give them drink. If you see someone who's in prison, visit them. The sick, visit them. The idea is that in the time until he comes back, we have a responsibility to be his hands and feet in the world. So that's this whole story. That's the idea of Matthew 24 and 25. Is Jesus is telling them, these things are going to happen very shortly, but what you need to really be concerned about is what I need you to do from now until eternity. And that's the story of Matthew 24 and 25. I went a little longer than I wanted to, but it's very important that we understand this, especially Matthew 24, because people will just take that completely out of context and make it mean something that is not meant to mean. Okay, so anyway, that's our message for today. Let's pray.